When you think of the most successful racing teams in history, you probably think of Scuderia Ferrari, or Martini Lancia, or Porsche Ilmor, or McLaren. But actually, what you probably don't think about is the most successful and largest racing team on the planet. Roger Penske's Team Penske. I have a caveat first. Roger Penske's team is one of, if not the largest racing teams in history. Trying to cover every single element in detail is like trying to cover the entire history of General Motors. There's a lot to unpack. So if a few things get skimmed over or missed that you're a big fan of, I apologize. But with that out of the way, let's start out with Roger himself. He was born to the executive of a major fabrication company, and following his father's entrepreneurial spirit, Roger bought, fixed up, and then sold cars for a profit. After graduating college in 1959, he began racing in the SCCA with a Porsche 718. He was good enough to win the Driver of the Year for the SCCA, but to be honest, he was never going to be a full-time racing driver. I mean, he was good, make no mistake. He won a NASCAR race and competed in 2 Formula 1 Grand Prix before retiring from the racing world and moving into its management. And that was a much better role for Roger, because in 1965 he founded Team Penske for Can-Am and Trans Am racing. In Can-Am, they started with a Lola T70, but that wasn't very great, so they switched to the McLaren M6 in 1967, and that wasn't much better. They only won a single race that season and returned to Lola, and, well, they sort of pinballed back and forth without much success until 1972, when they partnered with Porsche. It was called the 917-10K, and it finally broke the McLaren stranglehold. It was a genuinely great car, so Porsche and Penske made it a monster with a 917-30. The turbocharged flat 12 made in 1973 up to 1,600 horsepower in qualifying. It's the most powerful circuit racer in the history of motorsports. Not Formula 1, not Le Mans, Can-Am 1973. And it was ridiculously dominant. So dominant that it ended Can-Am because it was winning every single race in 1973. Most people would say, well, that's the car done. They can't do any more. But Penske, not wanting to have their investment go to waste after a very successful 73 season, took it to Talladega and shattered the FIA closed circuit speed record with an average speed of 221 miles an hour. You know, as a fun send-off. And remember, I said that our team was founded for both Can-Am and Trans Am. They were doing it at the same time. Penske raced Camaros and Javelins in the Trans Am series from 1968 to 1971, and in that time, they won the championship 3 times, one of which had the greatest automotive cheat in history. Back in 1968, Penske realized that if you soaked the body of the Camaro in acid, it could shave 400 pounds of weight out, while looking like it met the rules. It was a complete violation. It wasn't like one of those sneaky loopholes like Braun or Volvo did. No. It was just a straight-up cheat. It was way below the minimum rules. But it looked like the normal car. Now, of course, removing that much weight from the chassis while keeping the same proportions does remove a lot of structural support, so Penske solved the problem by installing the first full roll cage in the American sports car series. Now, Penske said that this was to make sure their driver was safe, and that's probably true to an extent, but mainly, the cage acted as the car's frame because, well, the car's actual frame was so thin. And that's actually how they were found out in 1968. It's because an official leaned on the bodywork after he put his clipboard on it, and the bodywork bent in when he put his elbow on it. But that didn't stop Penske. You see, always the thinker, he simply made the number 15 car, because they always run two vehicles, a normal Trans Am competitor completely to the rules as expected, and the number 16, the lightweight acid-dipped version. And they chose those numbers for a very specific reason. Based on the font that they used, the 6 and the 5 looked very similar. So they would simply switch the numbers around depending on whether it was qualifying or inspections. So the legal number 15 car would serve as both vehicles for the inspection process, and the lightweight number 16 car would serve as both vehicles for qualifying. And it worked. Not only was this number 16 1.5 seconds per lap faster than its legal twin, it came third overall at the Sebring 12-hour endurance race, beating Ferraris, Lolas, and GT40s. It was an incredible car that scored them a whole lot of wins and a whole lot of championships, and they retired from Trans Am after winning the 1971 title with the Javelin AMX. Now, that Camaro at Sebring was not an outlier for Penske because they had a lot of endurance operations. Their first big event, in fact, for a team was an endurance op, the 1966 24 Hours of Daytona in a Lola T70. And you know what? Just 3 years later, being Penske, they won the Daytona 24 outright. And then they didn't really do much else at Daytona because of other commitments. In fact, they didn't return to significant endurance racing until 2005 when they teamed up with Porsche again with the RS Spider LMP2 car. And it was pretty great. In 2008, it won Porsche's first major endurance race in half a decade at the 12 Hours of Sebring, and it proceeded to win 4 American Le Mans titles on the trot between 2006 and 2008. And that's just the start of it. In terms of engineering, its 3.4-liter V8 served as the basis for engines in the 919 LMP car and the 918 Hypercar. It's a very important car that does not get the recognition it deserves. Maybe it's because it existed during a often forgotten time of endurance racing. It raced between 2006 and 2010 when it retired. But, I don't know. It's an incredible car that had a long-lasting lifetime, and it was the last that Penske would race endurance-wise for 7 years. They wouldn't return to the class until IMSA with the Acura DPI category. And as expected, they won both the 2019 and 2020 DPI class teams championship. One key thing of note, all of these adventures are local. They're all within the US. But Penske, they wanted to branch out internationally, and one of their international escapisms was Australian V8 supercar touring cars, when they partnered with Dick Johnson Racing in 2015. And after 2 mediocre seasons, they signed rookie Scott McLaughlin in 2017, and their fortunes began to turn. They took that year's team's championship, and McLaughlin used their Falcons and Mustangs to win 3 titles back-to-back in 2018. Clearly not seeing anything else to do in the Australian Championship with a hat trick of championships, Penske sold their stake in Dick Johnson Racing after 2020. And that was not their only venture outside of the US borders, because they also entered this international sport called Formula One in 1974. And like most 1970s F1 cars, they had, you guessed it, a Cosworth DFV attached to a Hewland gearbox, and like most privateer teams, they didn't do very well. Out of 41 starts, they had just 1 win at the 1976 Austrian Grand Prix. But that win is the last win for an American licensed team in Formula One, so that's something, and to be honest, I don't think Haas is going to be doing anything anytime soon, so that record might stand for quite a long time. But let's not beat around the bush anymore. You know what they do, I know what they do. IndyCar is what Penske is really known for. Roger Penske himself is extremely interested in the sport, so much so that he bought Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the entire IndyCar series in 2019. And that is because Team Penske is the second oldest IndyCar team on the grid, first founded in 1968. But unlike their other oldest team, AJ Foyt Enterprises, they're far more successful because over the last 53 years, Team Penske have won 221 races, 18 Indy 500s, and 23 championships. And they've had some of the most famous drivers in history: Mark Donohue, Al Unser, Emerson Fittipaldi, Helio Castroneves, Simon Pagenaud, and more. And like their Porsche 917 and Can-Am, Penske created a car so powerful and so dominant, it broke IndyCar apart. Let's set the stage. After scoring in the 1993 Indy 500 and the championship, Penske began your usual digging through the upcoming 1994 rulebook. But it was their partners who developed the engines, Ilmor, that noticed something big. Something that needs an explanation. Nowadays, all of IndyCar is managed under one roof, but that wasn't always the case. From 1978 to 1996, Indy cars competed in races organized by both CART and the USAC. But gradually, as these organizations began encroaching on each other's territory more and more, CART began to push the USAC out of IndyCar racing to the point where the USAC only had control over sprint cars, the Silver Crown Series, and the Indy 500. Somehow, the small company that only has control over the Junior Series also had control over the most prestigious motor race in the world. But still, they only own one race, as opposed to almost every other race being owned by CART. As such, all teams built cars only for the CART rules and then just raced those specs at Indy. But Ilmor and Penske did something radical, and actually read the USAC rules for the Indy 500 and noticed something. In 1991, the USAC wanted more private competition in the Indy 500, so they added a rule which allowed for engines with larger displacement and more turbo pressure, provided they were cheaper, more simplistic pushrod engines. So, Penske, Ilmor, and Mercedes built the greatest pushrod Indy engine of all time. And in the meantime, they raised the PC-23 with a traditional engine that was actually pretty good. But the project was so secret. The engine was developed in what must be the Indy equivalent of the Manhattan Project. Only the leadership at Mercedes, Ilmor, and Penske fully understood what the project was. Months of secret testing ensued, and when it was finally ready, the engine was shipped from Germany to the US in pieces, just in case. And Penske only revealed the PC-23B a few days before the Indy 500 testing began. Of course, that secret nature didn't seem to matter, because the other competitors rather mocked these ancient 3.4-liter 2-valve pushrod V8s, as compared to their dual overhead cam Formula 1 style V8s. But they soon had to eat their words, because on the third day of practice, the pushrod dinosaur broke the 230-mile-an-hour barrier for the first time in 2 years. Then during qualifying, Al Unser Jr. went through the speed trap at 244 miles an hour on his way to a pole position at 228.011 miles per hour, which is almost 2 miles an hour faster than the next fastest car on a 3-lap average. 2 miles an hour didn't seem significant, but averaging that much speed compared to an IndyCar field at the Indy 500 is massive. The reason? Well, in an era when the fastest Indy cars made 850 horsepower max, the PC-23B was dynoed at 1,024 horsepower to the wheels. In fairness, the engine was actually not perfect. In fact, far from it. The engine made the car's balance atrocious, none of the Penske drivers liked it, and it was incredibly unreliable, causing 2 of the 3 cars that weekend to retire. But it didn't matter, because Al Unser Jr. didn't crash, and he proceeded to lap the entire field except Villeneuve, and won Penske their 9th Indy 500. And 9 wins later, the PC-23 took the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship. But it doesn't end there, because the engine and its methodology for construction was banned, or at least it was tried to be banned, because the ensuing outrage and engine regulation politics was one of the many factors that led to the CART IRL split that bankrupted CART and divided IndyCar until 2008. Nowadays there are spec rules, for IndyCar. You have to use very restrictive Honda engines or Chevrolet engines, and there's all the same chassis. So nothing like the PC23 or the Ilmor Mercedes engine could ever happen again. So a quick summary, I guess, is in order, because over the last 61 years, Roger Penske has gone from winning SCCA Driver of the Year to owning the most successful motorsport team on the planet. Across Can-Am, Trans Am, endurance racing, NASCAR, IndyCar, V8 Supercars, and Formula One, Penske has won over 500 races and 40-plus championships while employing some of the most famous drivers in some of the most famous cars of all time. And they've even led to the collapse of several racing series with their dominance and innovative outside-the-box thinking. Honestly, I don't think any team for the rest of history will be able to surpass the global juggernaut that is Team Penske. Scuderia Ferrari may be the most successful in Formula One history, and Porsche might have Le Mans in their back pocket whenever they need to get a few PR materials out there. But in terms of overall, I don't think any team, before, since, or in the future, will be able to match the varied success across multiple platforms, across multiple continents that Penske has. Their reach is phenomenal, and they're still growing to this day.